So today I'm basically going to talk about, let me just stop the video there, pollination best practice, and pretty much cover a lot of the ground that Herman and Brendan covered, but with some more detail. To begin with, a disclaimer stroke caveat. Despite what Herman said about really good data, the underpinning a lot of these issues, the reality is that in most of these best practices, there's actually really no hard data, not here or anywhere in the world. And for the most part, the reason for that is it's very challenging to do research on most of these questions. Results differ for every crop and for each cultivar and for every setting. And so to actually get repeatable results, or to actually be able to isolate all the variables, is almost impossible. Results vary from location to location, from the size of the trees, the density of the orchards, from all your surroundings, and from season to season. So really what you have in terms of best practice is literally that, best practice, best guesstimate, rather than actually hard underpinned scientific data to indicate that exactly this is, you must use precisely this amount of colonies, or the difference between taking bees in at this time or placing bees in this place. These are best guesses based on long-standing experience of a lot of people over a long time. So dealing with some of the issues and some of the questions and some of the practices involved. How many colonies do you need? Well, no one actually knows how many colonies you need, and this differs again, as I say, for each crop and for each cultivar in each setting and for each location. The size of the trees are obviously crucial, the density of the orchards in the fields, the competing forage, the surrounding forage that's around, the temperatures, the seasons, all of that will impact on the amount of bees that you would need to adequately pollinate your crop. There is no correct answer. Recommendation for deciduous fruit crops, recommendations from 1 colony to 10 colony, and there really is almost no hard definitive data to say if you had 2 colonies you would get this amount of pollination, and if you had 5 colonies you'd get this amount of pollination. And it's almost impossible to actually ever collect that type of data, because from season to season the requirements will differ. What you need to remember is that you really need to base it on the bee numbers in a bad year. Bees, commercial bees, bringing in bees are really an insurance policy to actually make sure that you have enough pollinators available. And as Herman said, it's better to have the fruit on the trees than have too much fruit on the trees than not enough. So base it on what the requirements are on a bad year, and if it happens to be a great year, well, then you get better pollination than you expected. When to bring them in? Best to bring them in at around about 10%, not too early. If you bring bees in too early, particularly in crops that are not really attractive to bees, then the bees lock onto other forage, particularly in crops like pears, sometimes some of the plums. When there's good competing forage in the environment, and remember, bees will happily fly 4 or 5 kilometers, they will abandon your target crop and move to the competing forage. When you should remove them, safely remove them at 90%. There's no need to actually keep bees in until the last flower is sitting on the tree. If you haven't got pollination by 90% blossom, you're not going to get in the last 10%. You should introduce and remove bees at night. And if they are done properly, if the hives are set up correctly, if they're introduced correctly, the bees should forage correctly and start pollinating correctly the day after they brought in. You should have adequate and normal foraging activity, and not a whole mass of bees that are heat stressed and sitting under the boxes. Only with certain unattractive crops, when the bees are really reluctant to use those crops, are different waves to be recommended. When you bring in a wave of bees, and then you bring in a second wave of bees to adequately pollinate the crops. But for the most part, in deciduous fruit, they don't flower long enough, and so a single wave is all that is required. Where to put them? Where should you put your colonies? Well, in orchards or cultivars or blocks, etc., where you have mature trees or trellises, it is necessary to have the bees at the long end of the rows, because bees will fly down the rows. And if you've got a trellis or solid blocks of trees, then they see it as a solid barrier, and they will fly down the rows and hardly move from row to row to row. So you must always have your colonies at the long ends of the rows. If you've got low-standing crops like onions or small pots of blueberries or things like that, then generally you can put the bees pretty much anywhere, because they'll fly over the top of the rows. When you have solid blocks that are closed off by windbreaks or closed off by any other barriers, then you need to actually get your bees close to the end of the rows, because otherwise, if you've got a closed block, they actually don't easily get into the block. In other circumstances, wherever possible, as Brendan said, you can take your bees far away. You can take your bees away from the blocks, and you can put them in, as Brent said, what I call the happy places. And the happy places are where it is the best place that you can put the bees in foraging, within sensible foraging distance, which is, say, within 500 meters from your orchards. And that is places where the bees are in the sun, where they are protected from the wind, where they are facing the sun, where they're off the ground, where the bees will actually come out of the boxes early in the morning, rather than them being sitting in deep shade or sitting right next to the rows of your target crops, where they are getting sprayed by pesticides and exposed to tractors and people working close to them. The more you can get your bees in a sensible, happy place for them, the more they will get out, the more they will disperse, and they will go to all your blocks. The only case when you shouldn't be doing this is when you really have a closed block, when you actually, where the block is surrounded by barriers where the bees will struggle to get in. Height is also a good factor. If you've got high ground, anywhere where you've got high ground where the bees can actually disperse widely, that is always to be advised, because that minimizes the impact of the rows. And if the bees are higher than the rows, then they can actually fly in almost all directions and literally drop into the different blocks and into the different orchards. In terms of colony distribution, again, except in the cases when you have closed blocks, it is absolutely fine to put all your colonies in small groups, scattered around the orchards and scattered around the farms. When you've got large fields, you can put them in groups of 6 or 4 or 8 colonies. The effect of having a lot of colonies in one place, it has a disruptive effect, local disruptive effect, and it forces the bees to forage widely and forces the bees to disperse into all the blocks. Provided you're always putting them in suitable sites, it is absolutely fine to disperse the bees around the farm. You obviously don't want them to have to forage kilometers to get to all your blocks, so don't put them on a big farm. Don't put all the bees in one place. You need to scatter them around the different areas of the farm. But provided you've got a reasonable number of suitable sites, you can clump the bees and they will actually readily disperse into all your orchards, rather than trying to religiously put one colony of bees at the end of each line. Nets, tunnels, cages, always challenging. Bees mostly don't like being under nets. To a lesser or great extent, that's true. You can accommodate, bees can accommodate nets. You can get bees to readily fly under nets. And of course, there are so many different reasons and so many different types of netting for birds and hails and microclimates. And my experience with nets in macadamias and avos and lychees and blueberries and plums is the devil is always in the detail. in terms of exactly how to manage your pollination and your bees. There isn't a one-step, a recipe, a hard recipe to fix. This is exactly how you should do it. You need to get really specialist advice for whatever your specific circumstances are, for your specific nets, for where you have your nets, why you have your nets, exactly what direction they are, where your barriers are, which sides of your nets you've got open. All those details will determine exactly where you best need to put your bees. But in general, the more space you've got above your plants in your nets, the better it is. So if you've got your foliage literally growing right up onto the net, then that makes it much more challenging for bees, because obviously then they are entirely restricted to flying up down the rows and they can't go across the rows. So the more space that you've got above the foliage, the better it is. Equally, the more light that you have into the net, the better it is, because from a flower point of view, but also from a bee navigation point of view. And in general, in principle, not in every single case, but in principle, my recommendations are you either have the bees in the nets or you have out the nets, and you don't have them halfway in the nets. And generally, I find that's what people do, is they put them halfway in the nets, and I'll explain what I mean by that. In the nets is when they are fully closed into a net. When you have fully closed nets, when you have the bee colonies inside the nets. And then the bees are absolutely forced, restricted to foraging inside the nets. They can't get out. You've closed all the gaps, all the holes, and they can't get out. And they have to forage on whatever you've got inside there, whether it is blueberries or tomatoes or whatever it is. Why would you close nets and lock bees down on the inside? Well, it is sensible when you have relatively unattractive crops, especially if you've got more attractive crops outside. If you put your bees on the outside, or if you leave the sides of the nets open, you bring the colonies in, and the majority of your bees will rapidly abandon your target crop, and they will go to the other forage, be that canola or wildflowers or whatever it is, and you will lose most of your forages. The other situation where sometimes it is sensible to have closed nets is when you've got closed pollination systems, when you're doing sort of breeding trials with different cultivars of, for example, onions, when you actually want to restrict pollen dispersal, and then you need to have closed nets. When you keep bees under nets like this, closed under nets, in almost all circumstances, the bees rapidly decline. And rapidly means they will lose probably half their strength within 7 to 10 days. In many cases, the pollen that is available under nets, whether it is macadamia or blueberries or even canola, is not sufficient to support brood rearing, and the colonies rapidly lose the capacity to produce brood, and they also rapidly lose field force as bees get lost under the nets and the colonies decline in size. If you're going to keep them permanently under nets and locked in under nets, you need to do one of three things to sustain the pollination under nets. One is you need to actually plant supplementary forage. So whatever your target crop is, you have to plant other things to supply the necessary pollen and nectar resources to sustain the bees under the nets, or you need to feed them, and feeding them normally is every few days, 3 or 4 days, to keep them going, and that is nectar and pollen sources. Or you need to rotate the bees out from under the nets every 10 to 14 days, putting new bees in and taking the colonies that were in out to recover. It is possible to condition the bees to do better under nets, but no matter how you condition them, if you lock them in under nets, bees actually struggle. In almost all circumstances, they will struggle, and they will decline in strength reasonably rapidly. Even in closed nets, if you've got fairly large plants, then you need to put them at the end of the large rows to allow them to navigate best. put them in the middle of these large rows only if you've got really big blocks. If you've got fairly small plants, you can scatter the bees around throughout the orchard, and they will find their way around. When you're putting the bees outside the nets, you should do that in pretty much all other circumstances, and that basically is about 95% of all the nets that I see. The circumstances are that it's not necessary to put the bees inside the nets, and it's not necessary to put the bees right next to the nets or cheek to jowl in the nets. Rather put them, as I say, in a nice happy place 500 meters away or 100 meters away, whatever the circumstances are, where the colonies are doing well and the colonies are in good condition, and they will fly into your nets. Just like in any other block, they will fly into your nets. Just make sure that you leave as many of the sides open as you possibly can, and that you actually have the long ends open, and the bees will actually readily fly into your nets, provided they are not too big. It's entirely a false narrative to think that just because you put the bees right next to the entrance of a net or a block, that means those bees are going into that net, or whether you put the bees right next to any particular orchard, that means those bees are working in that orchard. The bees are going to be working wherever they feel like working in that 2, 3, 4, 5 kilometer radius, and they will only consistently work under the nets if they fly in by themselves, so there's really no need putting them in a disadvantaged place where there's people and tractors and pesticides and shade. Rather put them where the colonies are happiest, and they will fly into your nets just like they would fly into any other block. Pesticides. All pesticides are bad for bees. Some are really bad, some are less. Fungicides, nutrient sprays, water. Wetters are often the biggest problem for bees in pollination. A wet bee is a dead bee, even though the compound is not particularly toxic. If you spray when the bees are foraging and the bees get wet, then they will die. So in principle, when you're using bees for pollination, spray as little as possible. Spray at night if you have to spray. If you have to spray the more bee-friendly product. Communication is key, as Brendan said. Always keep the beekeeper informed. Anything that damages or costs problems if the bees aren't foraging, or if the bees are being killed by the pesticides, that's damaging for both the beekeeper and the grower. Competitive forage. In general, the principle about competitive forage, particularly if you've got relatively unattractive crops, this is less so when you're pollinating macadamias or you're pollinating lychees. But if you have relatively unattractive crops, like some of the more recent plum cultivars and pears to a large extent, then you really want to make sure that you've got as little competing forage, as little forage available, or attractive forage available to the bees during pollination time as is possible, which means that during that week or 7 days or 14 days that your target crop is flowering, you do not want weeds in the field. You do not want other attractive crops in the vicinity, and you even don't want to actually have trees and shrubs or anything else in the near vicinity that are flowering at the same time and that are attractive to bees. Year after year after year, we have real problems with plum pollination with the bee. Whenever we have years of good rain, when the bees actually don't work on plums and they go up into the wildflowers, and seemingly this is just getting worse with more recent cultivars that are not particularly attractive to bees. But in general principle, your best guess, and I personally still think that this is the advice that I would give to most growers, is to actually remove as much alternative forage as possible and limit when the beekeeper brings the bees in. at 10% blossom, the only flowers that those bees should find right there on its doorstep are the target flowers. And even if they're reasonably unattractive cultivars, you will get good pollination for at least a reasonable period of time before the bees disperse widely enough to find alternative forage. I know there are ideas these days about magnet species, about planting weeds and other cultivars and cover crops in the middle of your target crop to attract the bees, to bring the bees into the area, and you'll get an overflow pollination. So if you leave the weeds flowering in a cultivar that's not particularly attractive, the bees get attracted to the weeds, and while they're there, they pollinate the plums or the apples or whatever they are. I remain unconvinced about this. I look forward to seeing the data on this. When I did work on this before, that's certainly not the results that I got. And for the most part, in the published literature, it suggests that this doesn't happen. The bees will get focused on whatever that more attractive crop is. You might get better bee activity in the area, but that doesn't mean that you're going to get better bee activity on your target crop, and you're not going to get better fruit set. So for the time being, I certainly still recommend, until I see data to the contrary, that the removal of weeds is to be advised if you've got relatively unattractive crops. The same applies for bee attractants. These have been around for 40 years, and there've been many things, whether they are sugar sprays or honey sprays, protein sprays, pheromone sprays, all kinds of things to spray to lock bees onto crops that are not particularly attractive. Still to this day, I would say there's very little hard data to suggest any of these really work. That you can certainly attract bees into the area by spraying anything on them, but that doesn't mean that you are actually increasing set or pollination of the target crops. And for the most part, the data is very consistent. When you do this, you actually reduce pollination and reduce fruit set rather than increase it. So for the most part, again, these are not things that I recommend until such time as I see better data to the contrary. Pollinizers are very important for the deciduous fruit crops and most crops. As Brendan said, there's more and more data to suggest that we're probably getting a large amount of in-hive pollen transfer, with a lot of the pollinizer pollen being transferred in-hive, which means the position of the pollinizers is probably not as crucial as we previously thought. But the jury's still out on a lot of this, so we still need a lot more work done on optimizing pollinizers. For the time being, the one thing that is absolutely critical is your overlapping flowering time. You have to have your pollinizers flowering at the same time as your target crop, otherwise you're always going to have problems. Certain other factors also being mentioned: put out water in hot areas. Always have water for the bees. That doesn't have to be freshwater sources, but the least distance that your bees have to forage for water, the more time they're going to be spending foraging on your target crops. Check the bees for ants if possible. Make sure that access roads are good, and as has been mentioned by both Brendan and by Herman, good contact, detailed pollination contracts between the growers and the beekeeper should be obligatory. Just a few final comments. You should only use registered beekeepers. That is a legal requirement. A grower that uses an unregistered beekeeper is in violation of the law. The law requires you only to use registered beekeepers that have a Dallard registration number. My recommendation would be to only use beekeepers that belong to a recognized organization, that have a proper inspection service, and that you have proper audits of some form or other. User beware in this. If people are promising you a free lunch at pollination at ridiculous prices, be careful what you're getting, because for the most part, I would suggest that you're not, as Brendan has explained, it takes a lot of time and money to set up a time and effort to set up proper bee colonies. It's not just any box that you've pulled out from your garden and taken into pollination. They need to be prepared properly, and that takes time. I would suggest also, it's too late after the fact. Once you are halfway into the pollination period, it's too late to actually suddenly think, oh, well, this beekeeper that provided me the boxes, they're rubbish bees and they're actually not delivering the service. You've lost that season. You can't pick up the phone then and organize another beekeeper 5 days into pollination. So for me, peace of mind is a big part of the deal. Just because this often comes up, honeybees are the one and only option that you really have in South Africa. There will be probably a little bit of success with some stalk-out flies, but we have no bumblebees. Commercializing carpenter bees is not really an option in South Africa. Honeybees are 99, 95, 98% of all the pollination in commercial deciduous fruit orchards. And we just have to make honeybee pollination as effective as it can be. It's not a matter that we can order in pollination from elsewhere, or we can just get an alternative pollinators. We have to make honeybees work. Both Brendan and I think Herman spoke about colony activity. I just want to make a last comment on it. It's not the beekeeper's job to ensure that the bee. It is the beekeeper's job to ensure that that sufficient honeybees are leaving the colony. It's not the beekeeper's job to make sure that they're on your target crop. That's the grower's job, etc. In terms of what is sufficient bees leaving the colony, my recommendation, somewhere around about 50 bees per minute in spring, 20 to 22 degrees in a day that's not too windy, that is sufficient. Summer crops, you can get up to about 100 bees per minute. But if you've got 50 bees coming out of a colony per minute, that is a really good thumb suck figure or best indication figure that colony meets standard pollination, Western Cape pollination standards. A colony that's 8 frames of bees, typically about 50 to 60 bees per minute in normal conditions. Also, you should develop, do counts on your trees, different areas, as Brendan has explained, with monitoring to figure out exactly what a reasonable or expected level of pollination on your crops are, and that will differ, as I said, for all different crops. For onions, it's around about 2 bees per umbel means acceptable pollination. These days, there's lots of all kinds of other measures that are being used to audit honeybee colonies. There's electrical monitoring and infrared monitoring. For me, the only things that really make sense, the best things to do are the 2 items that I've talked about: foraging activity, how many bees are coming out of the box, and are they going to the target crop. If you count in decent, in decent weather conditions, how many bees are coming out of the bee boxes, and are they going onto whatever your apples or your plums, that's going to tell you what your pollination level, give you a really good indication of how your pollination is going. And for my money, you don't really need any other monitoring or auditing.